Welcome back to the CHAR conference on the 5 years grand bargain and humanitarian reform. We come to our final round with a couple of spotlight sessions, as we like to name it, 3 topics and each in 30 minutes with one really interesting speaker and a very interesting facilitator I will introduce to you right now. Our first session will be on the grand bargain and gender, followed by the topic of innovation and humanitarian reform, and then to be followed by the ethics of humanitarian reform. Right now we focus on gender issues, and I'm very delighted to hand over straight away to my colleague Goda. She's a CHAR research fellow, but right now based in Rome, and she will facilitate this session and introduce the session to all of you, and then I only come back to share from the chat what you would like to bring in. So over to you, Goda, for this first spotlight session.
Thanks, Ralph. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Spotlight session, the Grand Bargain and Gender. My name is Goda Milasiute, and it is my great pleasure to facilitate the session, which is going to be a 30-minute discussion on gender considerations within the Grand Bargain process. To discuss this, I'm very happy to welcome Grace Ireri, who is the Local Humanitarian Partnerships Advisor at ActionAid. In this role, Grace is leading the implementation commitments on meaningful partnerships between ActionAid and its humanitarian partners, while focusing on promoting women-led localization in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somaliland, Kenya, Myanmar, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, amongst others. Grace is also leading the participation of ActionAid and women-led organization partners in global and African humanitarian platforms. These include the Feminist Humanitarian Network, the Localization Task Team of the Call to Action on Protection from Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies, the Charter for Change, as well as the Grand Bargain. Overall, Grace has 20 years of experience in conflict-sensitive development approaches, project management, capacity strengthening of civil society institutions, as well as rights-based humanitarian influencing. Thank you very much for joining us today, Grace. And before we start, I would just like to take a moment to encourage the audience to participate in chat. Your questions and comments are going to be monitored as we speak, and we'll try to cover as many of them as possible in the second half of our session. The session is quite short though, so please don't wait too long to raise your questions. Now, without further ado, I would like to ask you, Grace, to make a short input by telling us about the role of gender within the Grand Bargain, how gender became part of this process, and also what ActionAid does in this regard. The floor is yours, Grace.
Thank you very much, Goda, for having me in this session. I think where we'd start is saying that, for ActionAid, our approach is really centered around women's leadership. And this focuses across all our programs. So even in our humanitarian work, we have prioritized women in preparedness, response, as well as recovery efforts. So in terms of commitments that we have made as ActionAid on our humanitarian work and linked to the Grand Bargain, we have made commitments that will ensure more than 50% of women are in decision-making spaces at the community and frontline work. We've also committed that 50% or more of our partners will be women in our humanitarian work, and increasingly we're going to see we're going to facilitate quality funding and partnership for women-led organizations. So as we made our commitments to the Grand Bargain, this was underpinned with our humanitarian signature, and alongside women's leadership, we do have accountability in emergencies as part of our humanitarian signature. We do have resilience, which cuts across, as well as shifting power to local actors, which links very well with the localization work stream. So once we got onto the Grand Bargain, making our commitments, alongside other organizations that are promoting gender equality and transformation of the humanitarian system to make it work for women and girls, in crisis-affected contexts, we realized that the Grand Bargain was gender blind in terms of indicators, as well as in its governance structures. So there was no participation or recognition of gender even within the facilitation group. And so together with other like-minded organizations from 2016, we've been working under the umbrella of a lobby and very strong group called the Friends of Gender. And over the last 3-4 years, we have consistently made the voice of women count in this space. So we've been putting out guidance on how to monitor data that comes in terms of the signatories reporting in their annual reports. We've also been advocating for the place of gender and women and girls, transformation within the governance. We have been asking for opportunities to directly participate in the decisions that are being made at the grant, within the facilitation group. And alongside that, we've also increasingly reached out to women-led organizations in different countries, sharing with them what the grant bargain is. And over time, we have seen them take interest and even hold us accountable, even as signatories, in terms of how much we are publicly sharing on our commitments to the grant bargain. And more recently at the national level, really looking at what the grant bargain means for women and girls and their organizations at the national level. Back to you, Goda.
Yes, it seems that I'm back. Thank you, Grace. I really appreciate your contribution. And you have talked about structures. You touched upon the participation of women, localization, and generally, if you look at the work streams of the grant bargain through the gender lens, what's your take on that? And are there any promising practices in that regard?
One of the work streams that has really, made progress in terms of tracking, how much investment is going into gender empowerment and transformation of the humanitarian system to work for women and girls is a localization agenda, where we have seen guidance notes regarding, how to measure and how to track progress in terms of participation and leadership. We've also seen guidance notes that go and speak about, funding, best practices or promising practices around partnership, particularly between intermediaries, NGOs like ourselves and local partners. We've also seen, progress in terms of defining even who, a women-led or women rights organization is alongside, local actors. I think when we started off, that was not clear. So in terms of even tracking how much and meeting the target of 25%, its signatories needed, some clarity on that because we were getting different sets of data. So in terms of progress, I would definitely single out the localization workstream, which we have participated. But we also have seen progress within the cash, workstream. Cash programming is a big one, and listening to speakers in the earlier session in terms of the transformative nature of cash, and particularly providing, crisis-affected communities and people, and especially women and girls, dignity and choice when it comes to the responses. So in terms of, cash programming, that would be considered as one of the other work streams that has worked, quite well to support some of the gender, dimensions and to mainstream that. We've also seen progress in terms of, though limited in some of the other work streams, we're really looking at transparency, the work stream around participation recognition, which anchors a lot on accountability accountability to crisis-affected communities. But generally, overall, I think the missing gap we have seen is in terms of meeting the targets, the 25% target. We've also not seen the transformation of the humanitarian system, really listening to women and girls in the community. They still are faced with, barriers when it comes to their decisions and voices being heard. They still, their programs are underfunded when we look at how much money within and funding is going to support programming that would support women organizations, and not just GBV and protection. We're looking about women and other technical areas, whether it's education, it's healthcare. That is still quite underfunded. So in terms of the grant bargain being a transformative agreement, we still have a long way to go in terms of meeting that target. And then in terms of national level, and I'm happy our colleague who earlier spoke about the START Fund in Bangladesh, in terms of the constituency of actors, the wide range of local actors who are leading in response, both at the front line, as well as, just as national actors, in terms of, holding the donors in country, accountable in terms of meeting these commitments that they have made. I think there's still work to go in terms of having a candid discussion around where we are meeting this and what the gaps are and what it is that we can do to accelerate the realization of these commitments. And then we also would say that, in terms of other areas that we see the transformative nature of, the grant bargain for across the work streams is really, working together and not, collectively to meet some of the political barriers that continue, to face women-led and women rights organizations. So right from, participation in cluster meetings, we're still not seeing women organizations being able to access. And even when they access these spaces, in terms of their participation is minimized because of either distance, proximity. Some of the cluster meetings are held at the headquarter level, and women organizations are based in the front line. So when they look at the investment they need in terms of people and money and connectivity to be part of this, it takes away from the actual time when they'd be responding in the communities.
Right, thank you. And if I could just follow up on the the concept of gender transformation within the grant bargain and within humanitarian action more generally. So on the one hand, it seems that it's about the structures and processes and how the decisions are made. On the other hand, it's also what's happening when the aid is provided, and so also in connection with long-term planning, with the norm changing, and these processes. So do you agree that there are these two focuses that we need to keep in mind, and how do you see gender transformation?
Sure, Goda. One of the barriers to achieving progress for women is really around the inequalities that exist even before emergency situations. So looking at within the societies, looking within across the decision making, the inequalities that exist, whether it's patriarchal in nature or just structural barriers that women face, makes them more at risk in terms of being victims of gender-based violence. This is exacerbated in the context of crisis. But I think one of the other things that has come through is really the lack of recognition of women's contribution. Women have always been in community supporting work, but when it comes to recognize and decision making, they're excluded from these spaces. So when we talk about gender transformation, and that is where then you would consider the feminist humanitarian network as one of those movements of women that has come to challenge and deepen the understanding in terms of what are the barriers that exist, because we, looking at it in terms of the technical progress, women organizations, are able to, to work at that level. But in terms of, the political will that is required and to address the structural process and particularly, the barriers related to either, patriarchy or just colonial structures, to dismantle those and provide alternatives where women take a leadership of, humanitarian preparedness. They are the ones who are leading and making decisions. They are funded, their programs, well funded. They continue to hold grant bargain signatories, to account in terms of the promises that are made around not just funding, but in terms of quality funding to cover their institutional core running costs. This is where we're talking about the transformation that is needed within the humanitarian sector. And I'm really proud, as ActionAid being one of the members of the Feminist Humanitarian Network, alongside women champions, women across from Africa, from Asia, who have realized that, for this change to happen, they're the ones who are going to provide these alternatives and hold as, signatories and other humanitarian actors both at national and global level, accountable to deliver, life-saving interventions to fund their work, and also for their voice to count, because it has been there, but it has, continued to be excluded, and we need to have that, redressed.
Okay, thank you. And I would also like to ask you about the role of international NGOs in this context, since ActionAid is one. How do you see its role with regard to gender-sensitive localization, and also how is the role of international NGOs as intermediaries reconcilable with the localization goals?
Sure. One of the realizations, even as we work towards, 25% as directly as possible, is that donors are limited, whether through their own legal structures or even just ability to manage a number of our partners, that there is need for intermediaries, and that is where we have international NGOs like ourselves, and increasingly we might you'll be also seeing national actors who are able to form consortia where they serve in the role of intermediaries. So as signatories to the Grand Bargain and also to the Charter for Change, where we are constantly reviewing our partnership practices, we have committed ourselves to better and more equitable and accountable partnerships, where one of the things that we are looking at is to ensure that the voices of our partners is heard as directly as possible with donors. So in terms of the design of the programs, decision-making, our own accountability within the projects, is that we as equal partners to our national and community-based partners. And even in terms of, in the communications around, responses, around decisions, this is gives visibility to the work that is happening, led by women, led by other local actors, so that, in terms of representation of their work, this is adequately, represented. There are other areas that we are already looking at, and that is internally as international organizations. Transformation also needs to happen in terms of our own policies. We recognize that some of our own policies continue to create additional and unnecessary burden, to partners. And so in terms of changing our own practice, starting from the senior leadership of organizations, as well as redefining, especially the area of risk sharing. I think for the longest time, it's been a matter of risk management, but how can we better share risk, and whose risk is it anyways? Because part of the time and part of the challenge has been that due to our long bureaucratic practices as intermediaries, we find that we are slow, we do not deliver timely response to communities, we create additional barriers to their work. And even in terms of pushback on some of the policies, that continue to limit effectiveness of our partners. So in terms of how well we are advocating alongside our national partners to donors in terms of better practices in channeling of funding. I think the other area that we are also redefining is capacity. For the longest time, there's been that notion that, national and local actors are the ones who need to strengthen or to build their own capacity. And really, it's a misrepresentation of capacities that already exist in communities. Communities and the organizations that support them, with or without funding, are the first responders. And so in terms of knowledge and resources in emergencies, these are the biggest asset that they have. And so in terms of capacity, I think there's a lot of new thinking and progressive thinking that is going, that really, it's even in terms of the people, the organizations that actually need a lot of, capacity strengthening could be ourselves as intermediaries and international actors in terms of how to better support frontline and national organizations. There's also, in terms of women-led and women rights organizations, in terms of just limiting, in terms of limiting the areas where they can respond. Women organizations, whether or not it is defined as WASH, technique, whether it is public health, they continue to respond. So supporting them and packaging their responses to fit, within the frameworks. And if those and if they do not fit, actually to dismantle, the silos that we have created that make it difficult for funding and decision making to happen at the right place, which is really at the front line at the community. Then I think the final one that I really like to also touch on is advocacy. Over time, particularly in conflict situations, we have learned and we have seen that national and local actors and women rights organizations are best placed to lead in advocacy. So in terms of creating that space for them to engage with their governments, and supporting networks of women-led organizations, young people's organizations, to have a consistent voice and presence in terms of advocating for where they're seeing gaps in funding for disaster preparedness, for long-term resilience building, I think is an area as, intermediaries, we are seeing over time that, if we could channel and support, the coalition building of national actors across the national context, this would add more value than, just supporting project-based work.
Thank you, Grace. Thanks for your contributions. It's been very interesting looking at the time. I would like to check in with what's happening in the chat. Ralph, do we have any questions or comments there?
Hi, Goda. Happy to share a bit from the chat, and thanks for making me jump in. We have 2 comments in the chat, and I have an echo on my micro, but let's see if I can fix this here. We have 2 comments in the chat. One is Howard from Caritas sharing that a statement by Charter for Change. And in this statement, there is one of the key asks if back donors, like government donors, should make sure that their, for example, intermediary partners should make it a condition that the intermediaries are funding women-led organizations, that they are supporting their capacity building when they provide funds to these. So maybe that could be an interesting question if that could help, and that should be adopted as a precondition. And secondly, we have a comment from Iqbal from Coast, if I pronounce your name correctly, please bear with me, asking that under the Grand Bargain, women leaders' participation should be strengthened, but advocacy at country level to institutionalize it is also really crucial. Maybe you want to point on that one. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. So over to you, Grace.
Yeah, thanks. And I just like to applaud, the progress that has made by Charter for Change signatories. ActionAid has been, supporting the advocacy work that the Charter for Change and other like-minded networks. We do have the NEAR network, and I agree with you that in terms of making capacity strengthening a precondition, and this links a lot with what we've been hearing about. The project-based funding, that it doesn't make sense, to support women-led or young people's organization, local organizations, for 1 year. We're really talking about quality funding being multi-year funding, and within that funding, beyond the program support, for the intervention, whether it's going to be preparedness or just, for their long-term recovery, or holding their governments to account around some of the rights that should be accorded to them for, dignified recovery even after emergencies, is a whole area of flexible funding, as well as funding for institutional costs and overheads. One of the challenges that we agree has been there is the prescription in terms of, even the administrative costs that are extended to national partners, whether women-led or local organizations. And so what we're hearing from them, for it to be quality funding, they need to be given the opportunity to identify where the gaps are in terms of supporting their own institutional costs. We have costs that for a long time have not been considered as critical. We have insurance for staff We have, in terms of investment in some of, software, like now with the COVID and the new ways of working virtually, it's a big constraint when an organization cannot be able to sustain, the internet connectivity cost, quality gadgets for their staff. There's been that presumption that it's only maybe intermediary or donor organizations that would require software that can allow their staff to work. But with the COVID crisis, we realized that even national actors, when lockdowns are introduced, need to connect across various locations in the country. And so the value of quality connectivity costs, even for national organizations, is quite has quite been brought to the fore during this period. I think the other, touching on ICVA and the area around advocacy, I think it's just echoing what I had just said. A lot of advocacy with back donors, a lot of advocacy with national governments, and also in terms of advocacy just within the Grand Bargain, space. Much as we've talked a lot about progress in the Grand Bargain, I think working under the localization workstream, having 18, close to 18, I think that's the last count we had of national organizations that are participating. This still represents a very, a small fraction of local actors across, various contexts, and in particular in the global South. And one of the things that would make it more meaningful is having country level conversations around the Grand Bargain. And through the localization workstream, there's a pilot now to have country dialogues going on in 6 countries. And we hope that, this will bring new learning in terms of bringing national donors, national NGOs, national governments, as well as local actors round the table to unblock some of the barriers in terms of realizing the commitments their own organizations have made with regard to the Grand Bargain.
Thanks, Grace. I see we still have a couple of minutes left, so maybe we can take some more questions from the chat if there are any.
Sure, Goda, happy to share a follow-up question. Howard raises the question what actually INGOs, NGOs could do to better support especially women-led organizations in the Global South, but also leadership overall, pointing on that like ActionAid, for example, specializes in feminist approaches, but what could be minimum standards for others to follow up on? So if they have any comments to share on that one, maybe as a final question, that would be great.
Thanks, Charles. Over to you.
Sure. In terms of women's representation, I think we are calling for meaningful and equitable representation. So one of the areas that, in terms of supporting the cause by the feminist humanitarian network is to ensure that women are adequately or rightly represented. So if we do have, committees that are formed or structures that are formed governing either, projects or governing, interagency networks, is that, women should represent 50% as a minimum in terms of decision-making structures. Then in terms of supporting women-led organizations, there is, the appreciation that women are not just limited in terms of their programming. I think for a long time, there's been thinking that, women possibly will just be addressing gender-based violence, but we know that women are working in education sector, women are working across, provision of water. We also have healthcare. So it's to ensure that women's voices and women's leadership in all these key sectors that either life-saving or just developmental, is supported. And in terms of the funding and support that is given to women-led organizations, it should be, supportive of their institutional costs and as well as supportive for them to participate in key decision-making structures, whether the district level in their country, national, and also, moving on to, global levels. And I think the other critical area is really for us as intermediaries to let women organizations have access and have voice in donor, spaces. Let them represent themselves when as intermediaries, and where we have, they have capacity. Women's organizations have formed coalitions and networks. Let them lead in the response, and for us to seed, away from those spaces and find, other roles that we can play to support them. So I think that the idea is that, the women's movement is ripe for, direct funding, for direct representation of their programs and their voices. And we need to stop taking up the space of women-led organizations, and rightfully find other ways, to support their work, whether it is through supporting, coalition building, or maybe, in terms of some other program areas. But I think for a long time, we have taken up space for women organizations, which we now should cede, when it comes to the humanitarian system.
Thank you, Grace. I think it was the perfect ending point, and we are right on time. So thank you, everybody, for your questions and comments. Thanks, Ral, for connecting us with the audience, and many, many thanks to you, Grace, for your contributions. It was really great having you with us to discuss this important topic, also with a view of the next or new grand bargain, as you share, gender is not always given enough attention in this debate. So I'm really happy that with your help, we could put it in the spotlight, which it deserves. Thanks for watching, everybody, and please stay for the next session. With that, I hand over to the studio in Berlin.
Thanks for having me.